so today we're looking at quantitative and qualitative research as a broad description of what's involved with each one of them. So to really define and describe quantitative, define and describe qualitative, what are some of the philosophical differences between them, and to look at some of the concepts involved with ideas of variables and data. So it's a broad-based description of what's quantitative, what's qualitative. Any ideas? When I speak of qualitative research or quantitative research, what comes to mind? Quantitative research? Quantity? Statistics, yes. They each have a particular reason. Okay. So this is an important element about understanding which approach you would take in doing research, because they're two broad approaches, qualitative and quantitative. One is measuring, the other and deals with numbers, and the other is words dealing with experiences. So one in quantitative, you are quantifying the data, and the other you're describing the data. Okay? So that's what we're going to go through today as I put it together. So, qualitative and quantitative. Okay? Which one you will choose will depend on your research question. What are you trying to find out? The underlying philosophy of your research, and your preferences and skills. So as counselors, you are all naturally qualitative researchers. You're working with people's experiences, helping make sense of those experiences. That is qualitative research. That's what you're doing in therapy, in that sense. It's a kind of research. You're helping the client research their experience. And you're talking about and making sense of their experience. Okay? So you're all more inclined towards the qualitative approach. So your research question determines which approach you take. So if you frame a research question in how many people suffer from migraines, you're going to get a number, which is quantitative. How do migraine sufferers feel when they're suffering from migraine? Numbers won't answer that question. You've got to look at experience. So qualitative becomes your overall approach. So your research question determines your approach. Do not put the horse before the cart. That's only where your preferences and skills comes into play, because most people want, I don't want to do stats. But if your research question that you want answered involves stats, and then that's what you've got to do. You've got to do numbers. Okay, whereas most people try and squeeze what they wanted to do into the wrong box, and then they wonder why they get the dissertation wrong. Change your question then on how you're framing it. Sorry, this thing's slow and changing. Right. 4 main features which are distinct but related. We touched on 2 of them last week. Ontology, epistemology, your methodology, methods and techniques. These are the 4 key areas that determine your research. Okay? The ontology, how you, the researcher, view the world, and the assumptions that you make about the nature of world and reality. How do you make sense of knowledge, in other words? What do you know? So is it experiences that's interpreted and made sense of, or numbers that are measured? Okay, so don't get thrown with the word ontological. It's again another research term. How do you know your knowledge? Okay? And epistemology are the assumptions you make about the best way of investigating the world and reality. How do you know what you know? What framework are you using to know what you know? So if I want to know how bad is your migraine, I'm going to ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is your migraine? You will give me a number, and that will be a quantitative. So I'm measuring the world. Whereas when I'm asking you, what happens when you experience a migraine? I get flashing lights, I smell everything, noise is too difficult to manage. That is a qualitative, experiential, and interpreted experience. And that's a different way of knowing the world. Okay? Then those two elements determine your methodology as a whole. Do not confuse methodology with method. They are not the same thing, but they are related. Method is the cousin of methodology. It's one way of putting it. Or the little brother. Methodology is the overall research approach, and method is the specific details of what you do to collect your data. Okay? So methodology is the way you group together your research techniques and elements into a coherent picture. And the method and techniques are what you actually do in order to collect your data and carry out your investigations. To give an example, I want to understand the experience of migraines, of migraine sufferers. Depending on my question, then the overall methodology could be quantitative. I'm going to measure on a scale of 1 to 10 on the migraine index scale, if there is such a one, and they mark it off, and I'm taking blood pressure, readings as well, and anything else. Yeah? So you're getting, that's going to be your broad methodology. It's going to be a quantitative approach in which you are measuring. Your specific methods and techniques will be the questionnaire, taking of blood, measuring of blood pressure. Whereas if I'm taking the same topic, migraine sufferers and how they experience migraines, I'll be taking a qualitative point of view where I'm wanting to understand the unique experience of suffering chronic migraines. So I would then look at a description. What sets it off? What's the duration? How do you experience it? What are your signs and symptoms? How well do you function? And it'll be an interview, will be your method. The method and technique will be an interview, in which I ask the person for a description of their experiences and form a case study. So your methodology would be a case study, a qualitative case study approach. So they play hand in glove. But methodology is the broader approach, and the method is what you do specifically. How do you get your data from that person? Do you give them a questionnaire, or do you ask them? Okay? You clear there? You with me on this? No? Yes? Maybe? Okay, so you've got ontology. Is what approach you taking to understand knowledge? Is it factual, or is it interpreted? Epistemology, what approach? Qualitative, quantitative broadly. Methodology, again, quantitative, qualitative. But these are all determined by your research question. And the methods and techniques is what you specifically do to get the information. Another way of looking at how we construct reality of ontology. Okay, there are four main schools: realism, internal realism, relativism, and nominalism. Again, just technical words to describe different positions. There's no significant meaning in each of these. Don't get thrown by it. Okay? So realism is the world is real. There's a single truth out there, and we can find the facts through experiments. There is an objective reality out there that exists. So migraine sufferers who suffer migraines on a scale above 5 on a scale of 1 to 10 will have the following symptoms that you've measured and found it. It's reality. It's like this table. I can measure it. It's 3 by 4 by 5. And every time I measure it, it will be that. And that's fine for the physical sciences, where you can weigh things, take its temperature, break it apart and analyze its contents. But experiences? Not quite the right way of looking at the world. Because experiences are unique. There's no objective fact to an experience, except for that person. So realism in psychology and counseling approaches is not a good mindset to hold. Internal realism, the world is real, but it's almost impossible to examine it directly. The truth exists, but it's a bit obscure. But facts are concrete, but cannot always be revealed. We get them indirectly. Okay, so you get things like Beck's depression inventory, which is taking a group of factors associated with depression and saying, when you have these elements all together, this means you've got depression. But there's no way of actually making those real, like measuring the table. Again, they're slightly subjective, they're associated with each other, but not everybody has every symptom. Okay? You with me? Relativism, scientific laws are basically created by people to fit the view of reality. And there are many truths. And facts depend on the viewpoint of the observer. Okay, so now we're moving to the realm of it's all relative. You know, you've all heard that term, it's all relative. Depends on your position, your mood, where you were standing at the time. It's like the old story of 4 blind men describing an elephant. You know, one's got hold of the trunk, another's got hold of the tail, another's got hold of a leg. You're going to get 4 different descriptions. It's all relative. And the last area is nominalism. Reality is entirely created by people. There is no external truth. There is no truth. And then we create facts. Okay? The unconscious. There's no external truth about the unconscious. We've never been able to measure it or weigh it. The unconscious is a nominalist idea. But nobody's been able to actually measure it in the realism sense of the word. It's a created concept. Yes. Okay? But none of these are absolutes. They're often overlapping, but these are the 4 main ways in which we know the world. It's absolutely, it's sort of knowable. Well, it depends on the context, and we make everything up. And in therapy, we're often making things up with clients. We are dealing with their subjective experience. And if you have to ask anybody else in the family, well, is that what happened? They're going to go, what are you talking about? This is nonsense. Okay? So, epistemology is the way in which you choose to investigate the world. Positivism, social constructionism. Okay? So positives believe you can be objective and there's a realistic ontology. So there's linking to that one. They're in the realism category or internal realism, that it's the world is measurable to some degree. So positives believe there's a positive measure. You can draw a line and get a measure. Okay? Social constructionists believe that reality doesn't exist, it is constructed and given meaning by people. So we say sniffle, runny eyes, sneezing, sore throat. What do we call that? Cold, flu, hay fever, whatever. We've created a category to make sense of something. We have constructed a thing called flu, even though it's a real illness at another level. That's why it's this, it's 6 of one, half a dozen the other. Okay? And those fall into the relativistic ontology, so they fall into the relativism and nominalism areas. Or internal realism, like the flu, into relativism. You know, when is flu? I mean, ask any of the guys here, and the slightest sniffle, and God, we're in bed, guys. Man flu is very real. Epistemology and ontology then play the role into your methodology. So realists tend to have a positive approach. They gather quantitative data, and relatives have the social construct approach, and they gather qualitative data. So I'm just repeating what I've said a moment ago. They're not absolutes. People work a bit mixed methods on most things. Okay? Are you really involved or detached in your thinking about it? Okay, so those four elements all play a role in bringing together qualitative or quantitative approach to research. So that's sort of the background music. Okay? And this is sort of another way of putting it. This is what is often termed the research onion. So outside you've got your philosophies, pragmatism, interpretism, realism, positivism. Then the overall approach, deductive and inductive, which we touched on. Okay? Then your next level are your strategies, experiments, surveys, grounded theory, ethnography. That's your broader level. Then you make your choice within that. How are you going to do? Are you using a mixed method, multi-method, a single method? You're then looking at, are you doing a cross-sectional point or a longitudinal study? And finally, your techniques and procedures of collecting data, which is your method, is the middle point. Okay? Please, none of you consider a longitudinal study for your dissertation because you don't have the time. A longitudinal study is what? Long. Yeah, forever and ever and ever. That's when they're looking at people over a long period of time and measuring them on the same factors that they're investigating. Intelligence, hand-eye coordination. So you've got this program on TV following the 5-year-olds, and then there were 7, and then there were 9. That's a longitudinal study, and generally takes 20 years. Okay? You don't have that time for your dissertation. So most of you are doing what we call the cross-sectional. You're taking a slice of time and you're seeing where they are in the here and now. Okay. So always keep this in mind as to where you're coming from when you begin thinking about your dissertation. So we've discussed a bit of your philosophy. So just to remind you where we're at, you have positivism and the interpretivism. So with positivism, you've got the observable reality. You're able to measure it and get an objective with a little or no personal interpretation of the data. That's the key difference between qualitative and quantitative. In quantitative, you get a set of numbers, you put them through your statistical analysis or whatever it is, and you get an answer. How heavy are each of you? We will get a specific answer. How heavy do you each feel is relative. I might be 85 kilograms, but I feel 90. Or the other way around. Depending on the time of day and how tired I'm feeling. There's no interpretation in that way in quantitative work. Okay? You need a structured methodology to gain quantitative that is replicable and can be analyzed using stats. And that's the important element of a lot of quantitative work, is that if you do something, somebody else can come along and take what you've done and repeat it in another context and see if they get similar results. They should do in theory. So the interpretivism is you're researching human behavior. Generalizability is not of crucial importance, and you're looking at understanding the reality for the person. So you investigate all the people who suffer from migraines, and you will get a common or a theme of migraine sufferers. They will identify from that. You'll have to draw up migraine sufferers will have the following X, Y, and Z themes, and that's with a qualitative. So you're looking at the experience. It's localized to migraine sufferers in Newham or amongst Newham students. Okay, so your generalizability is much more limited than if you've had 100,000 participants all answer a questionnaire online. Much more generalizable. Okay, so last week we also touched on this, deductive and inductive. But this just gives you a slightly better way of looking at it. In deductive, you're going from a theory and an idea to collecting data and getting it confirmed. So from reading a book, I get the idea that all migraine sufferers must have suffered childhood abuse. That's my hypothesis. Then I go and collect the data. 100,000. Did you have a child abuse? Oh no. Child abuse and migrant sufferers are not correlated. They don't go together. Okay? So I'm testing a theory. You're going from an idea down. Whereas inductive, you're going from the bottom up. You're building. I keep seeing these people with certain set of symptoms or problems or issues. And then you collect data and you begin to form an idea about it, and then you develop theory. Okay? And that's a process used, most commonly is used now, the method used for that is known as grounded theory, where you, the end of collecting all this data, you come up with a theory. Particularly, this is very useful when you're working in an area where there's been little or no research. FGM, yeah. We don't know much about it because there's been so little research done on it. Yeah. So just remember, and that also determines how you will approach your data process. So in deductive, it's much more the scientific model, whereas the inductive is you're looking at the understanding of meaning that people attach to events, and you gradually collect that data over time. Grounded theory. It means it's inductive approach. You're going from collecting an experience of many people and forming a theory. There is no theory about it, or there's very limited theory about it. So this is often for novel or new research areas when you're using the inductive approach. Can you think of an area that hasn't been researched that you may want to do? An area of research that you may want to do where there's little known about it? Because there's lots of areas that haven't been researched for various reasons. Funding, maybe a new condition, you know. And it doesn't mean because there's little written on it that you shouldn't do those areas, people. Okay? So, and then you've got a range of research strategies that you can use depending are you quantitative or qualitative or where you lie in between. Okay? And with time we'll touch on each of these methods. So each of these are methodologies or strategies that you can use. So we won't go through them in detail right now because it'll just confuse. So again, just to remind you out of Saunders and Wilkes, which we had in the first slide. So you've got qualitative and quantitative, qualitative on the right, quantitative on the left, qualitative on the right, are the key differences around some of these key topics. So your research question determines whether you are quantitative or qualitative. Okay? If you're measuring something, you will always be quantitative. If you're getting a description of something, you are always qualitative. That's as simple as I can put it. Okay? They will overlap. Because sometimes you will get a measure of an experience. And so you're getting both and. Okay. So again, what you're dealing with at very simple elements are, one is really looking at this, you're looking for an objective truth. The other is you're looking to interpret the data to make sense of it based on what the client's been describing or the theory says about something. So, quantitative data is about quantities and about numbers. Qualitative data is the nature of things investigated and tends to be words rather than numbers. Okay? So again, your research question, if you have to answer your own question, that will give you an idea about whether you're quantitative or qualitative. What kind of answer would it look like? So give me a research question you want to deal with. do childhood abuse victims suffer from flashbacks? Okay? How would you research that? Quantitative or qualitatively? Okay? But you can do either. Okay? That's a broad thing. It depends on, you can measure it from either side. So you might find a post-traumatic stress questionnaire that you give to victims of childhood abuse and say, fill this in. So you then got a measure of flashbacks. That's quantitative. Okay? The average abuse victim suffers 3 flashbacks a month, or whatever it might be. Okay? Or, again, you can go to the qualitative. What kinds of flashbacks do victims have? And that would be then an interview. Or they fill in a description. Or they describe the experience of a flashback from beginning to end. And you do an analysis of that through phenomenology or discourse analysis. Mm. Mm. Subjects. You need to have access to them in the first place, or have a good idea where you could find them. That is the problem. So that's why I'm asking you to begin really thinking about your dissertation topics and ideas. And you need to think, are they accessible? Are they available? Where would you find these? And the 2 areas that are off limits are children and the NHS. Unless you're working in the NHS, you won't get permission. Their internal procedures to get ethical approval can take up to 8 months. You don't have the time. Okay, that's the primary reason. But if you happen to be working there and you can get ethical approval around something fairly quickly, go for it. With children, generally you're excluded because you have to get parental consent. And the ethical concerns around them are quite high. But it doesn't mean it's completely excluded. But if you want to, like somebody said, oh, I want to work with child sexual abusers and investigate. Or I said, where are you going to get these? Oh, the people in prison. How are you going to get to them in prison? Okay? You're not going to be led into Broadmoor. Okay? There's also a difference between primary and secondary data sources. What is primary? First hand, immediate. You're collecting the data from subjects. Second hand data sources are things like journals, historical archives, or review of literature. Mm. If you've got somebody, yeah, well, if you've still got permission for them to be completed, yeah, very possible. Okay. So you'll hear the term variable. So this is a new term, another again research term, to just explain what are you dealing with. So when somebody asks you, well, what are your variables? It's not what underwear you're wearing or what you had for breakfast. Okay? A variable is what are the things you are investigating. Okay? It's an empirical representation of a concept. So man, woman is a variable. Young, old. 1, 2 are variables. They're concrete representations of what you're looking for. Happy, unhappy, depressed, anxious are variables. It's a simple word for trying to, well, what are you researching? What are your variables you're researching? And the more defined your variables are, the better your research. So again, working with people who are suffering from depression. What does depression mean? Is it clinical depression or is it feeling sad? Okay, so you've got to be precise. When it comes to research, you unfortunately have to be precise in your variables. Okay? They provide operational measures that can be quantified and manipulated. How many men took part in your study? How many women? Who is included? Who is excluded? Those are your variables. So you want to invest people suffering from migraines. Do you want all sufferers? Only students, male, female? Because there are other variables that might influence that. Are migraines linked to the menstrual cycle? You're not going to include men in your study, by definition. You know. So you think about it as variables. That's as complex as the topic is in terms of variables. Okay. The concept represents an abstract idea and embodies the nature of observable phenomena or an interpretation of why such phenomena occur. So individual may be different in terms of the use of media. What you define as an active user could be distinguished from what you find as a passive user. So are you on Facebook once a day? Is that an active user? Or are you on it every 30 seconds? Again, it's about being specific in your variables and concepts and how you're defining things. So quantitative data is a kind of large element. You're gathering a lot of data. Generally, you're looking at hundreds, if not thousands. Okay. Surveys, you use a large number and you make use of the Likert scale. What is the Likert scale or Likert scale? In a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being worst and 5 being best, where would you place your level of happiness? That's the Likert scale. You've all done them. Many questionnaires. Observations, it's literally sitting and watching something happening, and you've got a coding element of how people use the new crossings or something like that. Secondary data, you can get large numbers of government figures, how many people were in prison for whatever last year, wherefore. Okay? You form a hypothesis, you look for correlations and clusters. So it's primarily statistics. What's wrong with quantitative research? Some things can't be measured or measured accurately. How big is your unconscious? It's not a measurable concept. Okay? Can be somewhat impersonal. Yeah, handing out questionnaires, you're collecting them back. Data can be quite static. It's snapshots in time. You're getting a measure of now. But they might give you a different answer tomorrow. Or next week. Or, you know, if we had had the Brexit vote without this Middle East crisis, we might have had a completely different vote. Or not. Who knows? Okay? You can tell a version of the truth with statistics as well, as the saying goes, lies, damn lies, and statistics. Okay? You make statistics talk for what you're wanting to prove. In qualitative approach, you're not necessarily involving numbers, you're involving words, pictures, experiences. And these can be photographs, video recordings, field notes, people's own words. How many blogs do you read? Are there favorite people you follow on the internet? That's like an online diary. I've got a name now. But something I've been interested in looking at doing is you've got a number of people who suffer from particular conditions. Manic depression, schizophrenia, whatever. And they're writing online blogs about their life. There you've got a diary. Publicly available. You don't even have to ask permission, though it would be polite. To analyze. You find 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 of these online blogs about being bipolar. You could do a discourse analysis. What kind of language do they use to describe themselves? Yeah? But you get a qualitative picture of these. You're starting with a broad question rather than a specific hypothesis. So you don't have a hypothesis, if this, then that, in qualitative research. You're trying to get a description. Okay? And you're developing theory rather than starting one. It tends to be inductive rather than deductive. in its approach. So you're going from an idea and building it up to a description. What's wrong with it? It can be very subjective, can't always be repeated. How many times have we recently heard famous psychology experiments have not been replicated? Okay. Can't always be generalized. It can't always give you definitive answers in the way quantitative research can. It's a bit wishy-washy, sometimes, or woolly. It can be easier to carry out or hide poor research, whereas in quantitative it's more difficult to hide numbers. In qualitative, we'll just leave that one out. Okay, so most of you will tend to do qualitative research for your dissertations because it's the nature of who you are as counselors. It's easier at one level, but more complex at another, because it is a subjective interpretation of what you're doing. So the type of approach you choose will be determined by your research question, your epistemology and ontological stances, and the skills and ability to use a certain approach. So if you ain't good at numbers, do qualitative. But we will get you there with numbers. A mixed method approach can be used as long as you make an informed choice and can justify it. It should generally be fine. So you can use a measure and an interview. You can use depression and what's your experience. So those who measure high on the depression scale have these experiences. Those who measure low on the depression scale have slightly different experiences. So you can use a mixed method. But beware of the limitations and manage them as best possible. Okay, so I found some links from one of the slides that I found and I was using. So have a look at these. There's some useful stuff around research. Keep them in mind for later on. You might not need them all now, but you can build them up for use later on. Found another useful lecture on SlideShare. Have a look at that. It goes on to some other elements, but the initial parts around quantitative and qualitative are quite useful. I've put some of them in the slides. Make use of those. Okay. Do make use of SlideShare and YouTube for exploring and research methods. Also look online at MOOCs, MOOCs. Online MOOCs, you put in MOOCs and you put in research, introduction to research, you might find other sites which explain really simply some of the issues involved. So a summary of today's work: quantitative, only 1 in 30 take the free ice cream. Qualitative, how did you feel when you saw free ice cream? Yeah? That's the essential difference. You've got a man standing behind the bushes observing and taking notes. And in qualitative, how did you feel? Excited, let's get him. Why was that? So you explore it. Whereas he's just got a number. Tells him very little. Okay, sorry about this morning's seminar, but I had an important OU meeting. There's a reading which I'm going to get if Reprographics is open, but I'll also put it up online for you guys to have a look at. Okay? Thank you.